First introduced in 2008 Sonic Unleashed, the boost formula would become the main gameplay style of the Sonic series for the next 16 years, with even the newest 3D Sonic game continuing that trend. With this new style of gameplay came a plethora of new mechanics that would become series staples, such as 2D sections, skydiving sections, and the topic of today's video, Quickstep Sections. Despite being a pretty simple mechanic by nature, they always managed to add some nice variation to a level by bringing in their own unique mechanics that kept the player engaged and on their toes. However, as time went on, they began to slowly lose everything that made them fun and engaging in the first place. In this video, I'll be going through and analyzing both the controls and mechanics of Quickstep Sections in every boost game, pointing out what they did right and what they did wrong, until ultimately coming to a conclusion on what could be done with them in the future. When established in Sonic Unleashed, the basic principles of a Quickstep section were restricting Sonic to a multiple lane path he could continuously run through while dodging incoming hazards using both his environment and varied moveset. Despite sounding like it'd make for some boring gameplay, Sonic Team managed to make a multi-layered system that for the most part kept the player's interest whenever entering one. One of the great things about Quickstep Sections in Unleashed is the risk versus reward system that applies to even the simplest layout thanks to the boost. The risk comes from choosing whether or not to use the boost. If you don't, then you'll have more time to react to the incoming obstacles and keep all your rings. If you do, then you'll have less time to react, but get through the section much quicker, ultimately leading to the reward of a faster time and better chance at getting the S rank. Something that's actually meaningful in Unleashed because they're not handed out like participation trophies. Aside from the boost, Sonic's moveset includes the ability to perform two different types of jumps. The first one is a normal jump that allows him to avoid taller hazards, but slows him down quite a bit due to air drag. The second is a short hop that maintains more of his forward momentum, but leaves him vulnerable to certain attacks, and is only viable for dodging hazards closer to the ground. He can also perform a slide that lets him quickly move under certain obstacles, but since the level design hardly takes advantage of it, you'll rarely ever use it. And of course, Sonic can perform the quick step to quickly dodge incoming hazards by moving from side to side. When it comes to the actual control of Sonic, he both feels and looks very nice. In Quickstep Sections, it's very important that the player has a reliable and responsive Sonic, which is definitely the case here where there is little to no input lag and Sonic has very consistent movement. Just as important as reliable controls is reliable visual feedback, which Sonic Unleashed also excels at. Pretty much every single animation flows perfectly into the next and perfectly conveys the current state of Sonic. Due to Quickstep Sections often being composed of 3 linear lanes, the most important part of making them fun is what kind of hazards and obstacles you encounter, which Sonic Unleashed has quite a few of. These hazards include bombs, spikes, speed bumps, and flamethrowers. In addition to these hazards, you'll also encounter various types of enemies, such as both versions of the Egg Fighters, the Egg Chasers, and the Interceptor. Getting hit by any of these will result in Sonic stumbling for a few seconds, leaving him vulnerable to more attacks and slowing you down in the process. The Egg Fighters can often be seen scattered around the road just wandering about. They're usually very easy to boost through, but if you're not careful, they'll punch you out of your boost state. The Egg Chasers always appear in groups of 3 and have a variety of attacks, such as shooting a massive laser beam down a single lane, dropping electrical tripwires, and shooting missiles onto a lane that then creates a wall of fire. The only way to defeat these guys is by knocking 2 Egg Fighters down their designated lane. The first Egg Fighter will temporarily stun them and the second will destroy them. This adds a nice layer of depth to both enemies, as now you're not just mindlessly boosting into the Egg Fighters, and you have to make constant quick decisions on which Egg Chaser you want to target for a moment of relief until another one eventually comes to take its place. The final enemy in these sections is the Interceptor, which acts almost as a mini-boss, as it usually appears on its own and acts as a sort of mixture of both previous enemies. Its main way of attacking is by sending a massive laser beam down a single lane, much like the Egg Chaser, but it can also punch the ground to send shockwaves at Sonic. If the player begins to slow down and gets too close to the Interceptor, it will charge up a massive punch to hit Sonic, much like the Egg Fighter. You can't attack this enemy, but it will usually destroy itself by the end of the Quickstep section, so it's mostly a matter of just surviving long enough to leave it behind. Now, on their own, each of these obstacles are pretty easy to manage, but it's when they're all paired up together that the fun really begins. The first pairing you'll often see is egg chasers in the sky with both bombs and egg fighters on the ground. This combination forces the player to constantly pay attention to what's going on in the sky and what's coming up ahead, whether they have to dodge a hazard or can take the opportunity to damage an enemy. Another example is the Interceptor attacking Sonic from the back while dodging incoming bombs from the front. This pairing also forces the player to divide their attention, but this time it's between two opposite ends of the screen while making sure to stay ahead of the Interceptor so as to not get punched. The base game does a good job of making effective pairings, but in my opinion, this mechanic is best exemplified in 3 different DLC stages. Windmill IO Act 4, which does an amazing job of combining tons of different hazards like bombs, spikes, flamethrowers, and speed bumps in a short level that requires extremely fast reaction times to complete. Savannah Citadel Act 5, which does a great job of combining every enemy by starting with both the egg chasers and egg fighters and then following up with an interceptor only to throw the egg chasers at you one more time. But by far the best example and one of the best Quickstep sections ever in my opinion has to be Rooftop Run Act 4, which manages to combine both enemies and hazards in a level that requires your complete attention all the way through. Despite their gameplay not being anything super complex, almost every Quickstep section in Sonic Unleashed manages to be engaging enough that you don't feel like you're mindlessly going forward due to a system with enough depth to be entertaining. Sonic Team managed to establish a solid foundation that shined in the DLC stages. Now, all they would have to do is build upon them by adding new mechanics and getting more experimental with the layouts themselves. Next up, let's see how Quickstep sections fared in Sonic Colors. Moving on to Sonic Colors, things immediately aren't looking too good as Sonic's movement has been slightly simplified compared to Unleashed. Unlike the previous game, Sonic can no longer quickstep in any part of the level. He must now be in a designated area and pick up enough speed for the game to place him on a spline that then allows him to quickstep. While this does kind of suck, especially for speedrunners, I don't really see this as a huge loss as in Unleashed you never really needed the quickstep outside its specific sections, and the reason as to why it's like this is very understandable. Colors needed to be compatible with the Wiimote, which only has like 4 buttons total with none of them being shoulder buttons. Aside from this change in how you activate the quickstep, pretty much everything else is the same. It still looks and feels really snappy and responsive. Unfortunately, when it comes to the actual design of these sections, many more changes were made for the worse. While they still follow the same basic principles established in Sonic Unleashed, many of the mechanics were either heavily stripped back or outright removed. Hazards like the bombs and flamethrowers have been completely removed, and others like the spikes and speed bumps each only appear in around 1 or 2 levels. The egg chasers return, but they've lost all of their much needed attack variety and difficulty. They can no longer shoot missiles or drop electrical tripwires, despite doing so in a Sonic Simulator stage, and all their attack patterns have become extremely slow to the point that you'll always have more than enough time to get out of their way. Fortunately, not all is lost as egg pawns take the place of egg fighters and continue to serve as a counter-attack to the egg chasers. Though unfortunately this mechanic isn't nearly as prevalent as it was in Unleashed, with very few quickstep sections actually utilizing it. Pretty much the same goes for the Interceptor, which returns in the form of the Big Chaser. It can now shoot lasers down 2 lanes rather than just 1, which is a neat upgrade, but its shockwave attack was completely removed. The best thing about the Big Chaser is that in order to stay away from its punches, you need boost, which is infamously scarce in Sonic Colors. That is, unless you learn to manage and conserve your boost throughout the level, which then rewards you with the opportunity to completely ignore the mini-boss until it kills itself. In addition to the returning enemies from Unleashed, Sonic Colors adds one more in the form of moto bugs that literally pull up on Sonic and try to run him off the road. To attack, you can either quickstep or boost into them, but either way you'll need to constantly be on the move. Certain moto bugs will have boost capsules inside them, and every once in a while a black moto bug will appear that will take out every enemy on screen. This type of enemy doesn't appear that often, but they do have an entire level dedicated to them in Asteroid Coaster, which is pretty neat. The worst thing about Quickstep Sections in Sonic Colors isn't the enemies or hazards themselves, it's how they're utilized. So many Quickstep Sections in Sonic Colors have the player running through empty roads with nothing to do, and even when they do have enemies or hazards present, unlike Sonic Unleashed, they're rarely ever paired up with each other, which just makes them extremely easy to avoid with little to no thought. They do try to remedy this problem by having extra rings or whisk capsules on different lanes to encourage more varied and risky gameplay, but it's not enough. Even in Terminal Velocity, the one level that throws pretty much every mechanic in the game at you, fails to reach the highs of the Quickstep Sections in Sonic Unleashed. Overall, Quickstep Sections in Sonic Colors received quite a downgrade compared to their debut in Sonic Unleashed, but we still have 3 games to go through. Maybe Sonic Team will have realized their mistakes and return Quickstep Sections to the way they were before. Next up, let's check out Quickstep Sections in Sonic Generations. Sonic Generations returns to the PS3 and Xbox 360, and with it, the ability to quickstep wherever you want. The quickstep still controls great, but unfortunately things have only gotten worse on the gameplay side of things. Sonic Generations continues the trend of having very simple layouts that require little to no input from the player. This can especially be seen in certain levels with massive set-piece quickstep sections like Speed Highway, where you run down a building and have to dodge some pillars. This sounds like a cool concept, but the actual layout itself is mind-numbingly simple that it gets boring really fast. Another example of this can be seen in Rooftop Run, where you go through an alternate version of the Unleashed Rooftop Run ending, but instead of only being chased by some egg chasers, there's also a huge Eggman airship that shoots lasers towards Sonic. Again, it sounds like a cool concept, but in execution, it's incredibly boring because both the egg chasers and airship can be defeated extremely fast. Not that it makes much of a difference because they hardly even attack in the first place. However, the absolute worst quickstep section in the entire series has to be the gun truck chase in City Escape. Why is this the worst, you ask? Well, because you can literally hold the boost button down for the entire section and win no problem. The gun truck has some buzzsaws that aim down a single lane, but because Sonic is always boosting ahead of it and the track is constantly shifting, it poses no real threat to the player. Even if it did manage to hit Sonic, there is no real punishment because you can immediately collect all your rings back and the S rank is so forgiving. This is the perfect example of how not to design a quickstep section. A completely linear layout with zero obstacles and a total pushover of an enemy that you can completely ignore is not good game design. That's without mentioning the worst part is that it lasts an entire minute. That's an entire minute of mindlessly holding the boost button until the level finally ends. It's not even a familiar situation to the big chaser in Colors, as endlessly boosting to avoid that enemy was a reward for proper boost management all throughout the level. Here you would have to purposely play badly to run out of boost. Fortunately, not everything is terrible, as the ending quickstep section in Crisis City is actually pretty solid. It brings back some elements from Unleashed, like dividing the player's attention from what's on the ground and what's in the air, while also introducing some new ideas like having multiple levels that change in terms of speed and difficulty depending on which route you take. Neat stuff like this adds some nice risk versus reward decision making and encourages replayability. So overall, quickstep sections stayed relatively similar to those in Colors, except with minor changes that simplified the gameplay to the point many of them became pretty mindless. An argument could be made that quickstep sections in Generations prioritize the spectacle in order to celebrate iconic moments in the series, but I personally don't think that's a good excuse for unengaging gameplay. Hopefully they realize what a mistake this is and finally make a return to form in the next game. After taking a small detour with Sonic Lost World, Sonic Team returns to the boost with Sonic Forces. With this game came many changes to the Quickstep, and unfortunately it's all for the worse. The biggest change is the controls. When using the bumpers to Quickstep, there's often a noticeable delay from when you press the button to when Sonic performs the move, not to mention there are times when the move just doesn't work at all. The weirdest part about all this is that if you use the analog stick to Quickstep, none of these issues apply. Sonic feels extremely smooth and responsive, almost on the same level if not more so than Unleashed, Colors, and Gens. Another downgrade is the automation in these sections. It used to be that you could choose your own pace, but in Forces, the majority of Quickstep sections take control from the player and automatically push Sonic forward. Sonic also loses the ability to short hop in this game, which would be an issue if Sonic Team didn't get rid of every environmental hazard. Oh wait, how could I forget about the 2 sets of spikes all the way down here in Prison Hall. At least they added 2 new hazards in the form of these spiked wheels and laser cannons that can hide into the ground, but unfortunately they're both seen for around 11 seconds each in the entirety of the game and follow very basic patterns. At least you can always count on the Egg Chasers to make an appearance, only now with this really ugly redesign and absolutely none of the depth it used to have. Lasers are all it can do now, you can't even launch enemies at them anymore, and their attack patterns are extremely simple. Speaking of simple things, how about we look at the layouts themselves? There are about 5 Quickstep sections in the entire game, and all of them have extremely simple layouts that boil down to moving left and right a few times until it's over. Unless you're in Sunset Heights where you can do nothing at all and win. It must be a reference to City Escape. The only thing left of note to mention is the new Quickstep animation that looks absolutely terrible. If you do a Quickstep while not boosting, Sonic will quickly snap into his boosting pose, awkwardly stretch his leg out with no smear effect, and then snap back to his normal running animation. If you do a Quickstep while boosting, Sonic will do the opposite and have a few frames of his non-boosting pose right as the animation ends and he returns to normal. These little individual issues aren't that noticeable in normal gameplay, but they do combine to make the Quickstep look pretty janky. My best explanation for why it looks like this is because the animation was originally made for the avatar, who is always in the same running pose and doesn't suffer from the weird snapping issues that Sonic does. I think the Egg Chasers are a good representation of Quickstep sections as a whole. A solid idea introduced in Sonic Unleashed, slowly stripped of everything that made it fun and unique, until all that was left was a bland and boring joke of a mechanic. The best part of hitting rock bottom is that you can only go up from there. Let's see how the next evolution of Sonic the Hedgehog handles Quickstep sections. As you all know, Sonic Frontiers introduced the brand new open zone formula, which aimed to focus on open-ended platforming instead of the hallway-based gameplay style of the Boost games. Despite this clash in philosophies, Sonic Team still found a way to sneak in a handful of Quickstep sections in the form of bosses and the traditional cyberspace stages. In Sonic Frontiers, there are 2 types of Quickstep sections that look the same but actually play quite differently. The first type are those set on an endless path seen in the Squid Guardian and Wyvern introduction. Controls wise, these behave very similar to the path seen in Starlight Carnival, where Sonic automatically runs forward with only the ability to jump and switch lanes at your disposal. Same as Sonic Forces, you have the ability to choose between using the bumpers or analog stick to Quickstep. This is way more useful now that the boost is on the right trigger, which makes using the bumpers quite uncomfortable. Something unlike Forces is how damn quick and responsive the Quickstep actually is. It's so fast that you can move from the left to the right side of the track in less than a second. Unfortunately, this comes at the cost of the animation continuing to look pretty bad, despite some small fixes being made, like Sonic no longer switching running poses for a few frames. So what about the gameplay? Did they finally improve things? Well, all you do is mindlessly run forward and dodge some extremely simple hazards. Oh wait, I forgot, in the Wyvern section you can also mindlessly homing attack some lasers. Like Generations, the argument can be made that these are meant for spectacle over everything, but I still don't think that's a good excuse, as seeing the same thing for the millionth time while pressing one button every 5 seconds isn't my idea of fun. Besides, it's not like we haven't already seen this endless road gimmick done better in other Sonic games. The second type of quickstep section in this game are those that follow the more traditional design of the past games. The first of these sections can be found in Cyberspace Stage 4-1. Layout wise, it's extremely simple, but at least they brought back the bombs from Unleashed. The real issue with these sections is just how horrible they feel to control compared to the aforementioned type. In these sections, you can only use the bumpers to quickstep, which like I said is quite uncomfortable and still has the delay from forces, except to an even worse extent. This massive delay is antithetical to the quickstep, as its entire purpose was to give the player the ability to quickly and reliably dodge incoming obstacles. Without that reliability, it becomes more of a liability. In this specific section, there's also a very common bug where if Sonic quicksteps into a dash panel, he will keep his diagonal momentum and either land on another lane or fall off the platform. Another huge issue can be found in one of the Coco challenges, in which Sonic will often overshoot his quickstep towards the middle lane and cover a much wider gap than intended. Both the input delay and inconsistent placement make this very simple layout a struggle to play because of how the player has to constantly fight with the janky controls. Despite all this bad, there's at least a light at the end of the tunnel, a glimmer of hope in the form of this quickstep section in the final Horizon level 4-G. Unfortunately, the controls still feel horrible, but what I wanted to highlight is the layout itself. The first section is still very simple, but it's at least cool to see that they're finally using the cars for something other than set dressing. At the end of this section, the game offers you the choice between a top and a bottom path. Taking the top path puts Sonic alongside a vertical road where there are some trucks with egg springs attached that can push Sonic off the track and to his death. They're admittedly very easy to dodge, but the idea itself is what's pretty cool and creative. Further expanding on stuff like this is partly what the quickstep sections desperately need. Choosing to take the bottom path puts Sonic on a descending road that has tons of cars you need to avoid. There's even a hidden dash hoop obscured by some floating cars you need to maneuver around. Even though this is still very basic, it at least requires some input and thought from the player, which is something quickstep sections haven't done for a long time. So overall, Sonic Frontiers continues the downward trend by having even worse controls and mindless layouts. Despite this, the final Horizon seems to show a push by Sonic Team to reinvigorate quickstep sections with more interesting layouts and obstacles, so there's at least some hope they'll be truly great the next time they return. But what do you guys think? Do you think quickstep sections will ever return to the same level of quality they were in Unleashed, or would you rather they just get rid of them altogether? Let me know down below, but without further ado, I'll see you guys next time.